They're gone, all of them. Those were the first words he said out loud that morning, to no one, to the empty air over an empty pasture. You know that feeling, when the ground you counted on is suddenly not there, when the thing you built your whole small life around vanishes between dusk and dawn. Stay with me, because a man who thought he had lost everything was about to be found by the one person nobody in that valley would listen to, and the truth she carried at his fence would either save him or finish him. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? His name was Silas Renner, and he had come to that stretch of dry country west of the ridge 11 years before, with a wife named Cora and $40 and a plan no bigger than a lifetime. Cora had been the one. She could look at a bare quarter section of rock and greasewood and see a house with a porch on it, see fruit trees that had no business surviving, see children who never came. Silas had the hands, and Cora had the eyes, and between the two of them, they had made a small place work where 3 other families had already failed and gone. And then a fever went through the valley in the 9th week of a wet spring, and it took Cora 9 days, and it left Silas standing in a house she had imagined without the woman who imagined it. That was 4 years past now. He did not fall apart, because falling apart was a luxury a man alone with livestock could not afford. He got up. He worked. He told himself that solitude was only simplification, that a life narrowed down to the animals and the fences and the weather was a life a man could still stand inside of. He kept the porch he wanted. He never sat on it. Over the 4 years since, the place became something people in the town of Dolan's Wells spoke of with a kind of careful respect. The widower Renner, who never asked for anything. He had built his herd back to 140 head of good cattle, every one of them earned, every one of them the difference between staying and going under. That herd was not wealth to him. It was the only proof left that the two of them had ever built anything at all. That was what made the empty pasture so terrible. He had counted them at dusk the night before, 140, bedded down in the low ground by the creek where the grass held. He had gone in, banked the fire, slept the thin sleep of a man who trusts nothing. And he woke before light to a silence that was wrong, a silence with no cattle in it. And he walked out into the gray and found the gate standing open, and the ground churned, and the whole herd gone, as if the earth had simply taken them back. 140 head, gone in the dark. No shot, no bellow. He had heard nothing but the open gate and a chill working up his spine. He knelt at the gate in the half-light and read the ground the way Cora had taught him to read. There were tracks, not the loose scattered drift of cattle wandering, but the tight driven pattern of animals moved with purpose by men who knew how to move them quiet. Shod horses on the flanks. Someone had walked them out slow so they wouldn't run and wake him, then pushed them hard once they cleared the far rise. This was not misfortune. This was theft, deliberate and skilled, and a man does not lose 140 head to skilled thieves and simply build again. That kind of loss ends a place. He felt the old flat calm settle over him, the calm that had gotten him through 9 days of watching Cora go, the calm of a man deciding to survive a thing that ought to break him. And it was in that gray, hollowed-out moment, kneeling at his own gate, with everything gone, that he looked up and saw her. She was standing at his fence line, perhaps 40 paces off, on the far side where the pasture wire met the open country. A woman, still as the fence post beside her, a wool blanket the color of dried blood around her shoulders against the dawn cold. She was not from the town. He knew that the way you know a season is turning. She was Apache, and she had come out of the country to the west on foot, and she was watching him with a stillness that had no fear in it and no apology. In 11 years, he had learned the unwritten law of that valley, the way everyone learned it. You did not speak to those people, and they did not speak to you. And the whole arrangement was held together by fear and old blood and a silence nobody named. He stood up slow. His rifle was leaned against the gatepost within reach, and his hand went toward it out of pure habit, the animal habit of a man alone. She saw the hand move. She did not move at all. And something in that, the refusal to flinch, the flat steadiness of a person who had decided a long time ago what she was and was not afraid of, made him take his hand back off the rifle. They looked at each other across 40 paces of ruined ground and open wire, and the light kept coming up over the rock behind her, and neither of them said a word for the length of time it takes to make a decision. Then she lifted one hand and pointed, not at him, past him to the north and west, along the very line the tracks had run. And she spoke in careful, deliberate English, 4 words across the cold air. Around Dolan's Wells, there were 100 men who would have told you an Apache woman at your fence at dawn was a thing to answer with the rifle and no questions. There were 100 men who would have told you her people were the reason for every stolen thing and every open gate in the whole territory, because that was the story the valley told itself, the story that let certain men do certain things in the dark. Silas had never fully believed that story because Cora had never believed it, and he had married Cora's eyes along with the rest of her. So he did not reach for the rifle. He walked down the fence line toward her, instead slow, hands loose, until only the wire stood between them. "What men?" he said. "6," she said. "Before the moon set. They came from the town road. They pushed your cattle quiet, then hard." She paused, and her dark eyes held his without wavering. One rode a gray horse with a white face. He gave the orders. Silas felt something cold and certain go through him, because he knew a gray horse with a white face. Everybody in Dolan's Wells knew that horse. It belonged to a man named Ambrose Kell. He had come in with money nobody could account for, and had spent 15 years turning that money into land and land into more money, buying out the failed and the frightened, holding paper on half the small outfits between the ridge and the river. He owned the bank in all but name, owned the man who called himself the county's law, owned the story the town told about who could be trusted and who could not. For 2 years, he had been pressing Silas to sell, offering first, then hinting, then reminding him how alone a man out there was, how much could happen to a place with no neighbors close. Silas had refused every time, plainly in the fewest words. And now, his herd was gone in the night, driven by 6 men and a gray horse with a white face. And here was the one witness in the whole country whose word no jury and no lawmen in Dolan's Wells would ever hear. "You know whose horse that is," Silas said. It was not a question. I know what men do when they think no one is watching, she answered. I was watching. Your people do not see me. He asked her name, because it seemed the only decent thing left to do. She told him it was not a thing he could say correctly, and not a thing she gave to strangers, and that the town called her by a name that was not hers, and that he could call her Mara if he needed something to call her. He told her his, and there they stood, a widower, whose life had just been carried off in the dark, and a woman the whole valley had agreed not to see. The two of them alone in knowing the truth, separated by a fence and by everything the country had built to keep them from ever speaking. Why tell me, he said. You could have kept walking. It's nothing to you. For a moment, she didn't answer. The light had reached her face now, and he could see she was younger than the blanket, and the stillness had made her seem, and that there was a tiredness in her that was older than her years. When she spoke, it was slow, and it had the weight of something she had decided before she ever came to his fence. Those men burned a camp by the river 2 nights past, she said. They do this and blame my people, and your law believes them because it wants to. I have no one left to tell. But you, they will believe if you have a witness who cannot be called a liar because she was there. So I will be your witness, and you will be mine. This is the only justice either of us will get. It was, he understood, a bargain. She was not offering charity, and she was not asking for it. She was offering the one thing each of them had that the other needed, the truth, and asking that they carry it together because neither could carry it alone. A man who has just lost everything learns fast what is worth having, and he knew this was worth having. All right, he said. Come in off the wire. There's coffee, and it's cold out here. And after a long moment, she came through the gate. That was the first day. There would be many days, and each of them added something. She would not stay in the house. She took the lean-to off the barn, and Silas did not argue, because he understood that a person who has had a camp burn does not want walls closing on them, and because he understood that she was watching him too, testing whether he was the kind of man the valley said all men like him were. He made no move toward her and asked nothing of her but the truth she had already given, and slowly over the first week she began to give more. She knew cattle country better than he did. That was the first thing that unsettled his pride and then relieved it. On the second day, when he saddled to ride the tracks north, she showed him where the drive had split, how 4 of the men had taken the main herd toward the river breaks, and 2 had cut a smaller bunch, maybe 30 head, off to the east to muddy the trail for anyone fool enough to follow. He would have followed the smaller bunch. He would have ridden 2 days the wrong direction. She read the ground and saved him from it in the space of a minute, and she did it without a flicker of triumph, just a flat certainty, pointing, saying, "There the heavy sign goes. There the rest is a lie they left for you." He began to see how she had survived. She missed nothing. She could tell him how many hours old a track was by the way the crushed grass had lifted or failed to lift. She could tell him which of the 6 men was heavy in the saddle, and which favored his left rein, and which one, on the gray horse, hung back and let the others do the work. She read the country the way Cora had read the sky, and it did to his chest something he had spent 4 years making sure nothing did to his chest anymore. They were careful with each other. In the evenings, when the work was done, He would sit on the step by the barn, and she would sit some distance off with her back to the wall. And for the first days, they hardly spoke at all. But the silence changed. At first it was the silence of two strangers, each keeping the other in the corner of an eye. Then it became something else, the silence of two people who did not need to fill the air. He noticed the change the way you notice a season, not on any one day, but all at once. Looking back, she asked him, on the fourth evening, about the porch. Why the good house had a fine porch and no chair on it, and grass grown up along its edge like it had never been used. He surprised himself by telling her. He told her about Cora, and the fever, and the 9 days, and the porch Cora had wanted so she could sit and watch the light leave the rock in the evening, and how he had never once sat on it, because to sit on it alone. Mara listened the way she watched, completely, without hurry, missing nothing. When he was done, she did not offer him comfort, which he could not have stood, and she did not tell him she was sorry, which would have been a lie between strangers. She said, only the dead see farther than we do. She built you a place to sit for when you were ready. She was not building it for herself. And Silas had to look a long time at the rock going dark so that she would not see his face. Not all at once, and never more than she chose to give. She had had a husband and a child, and the same kinds of men who took his cattle had taken them, years before, in a different valley under the same lie, that her people were the thieves, the killers, the shadow. She had been drifting since going where the burned did not follow, until the burned had found her again at the river 2 nights before she came to his fence. She did not weep, telling it. Her voice was flat and level as a table. But he understood, listening, that her steadiness was not the absence of grief. It was grief that had been carried so long it had become the shape of the person. He knew that shape. He had been walking around inside it for 4 years. You did not reach for the gun, she said to him, once on the 6th night out of nothing. At the fence your hand went, and then it stopped. Why, he thought about it honestly. Because you didn't flinch, he said. A person who means you harm flinches when you go for a gun. You just looked at me, and because my wife wouldn't have reached for it, and I'd try to be the man she thought I was. He paused. And because I was tired of the story everybody tells out here. I've never once seen it be true, but I've seen a lot of men use it. She was quiet a while. Then she said, that is why I chose your fence and no other. I watched 3 days before the men came. I watched who you were when you thought no one saw. A man alone shows what he is. You were kind to a lame steer. You buried a dog. I knew you would not shoot me. A pause, and then something almost like the ghost of dryness in her voice. I am not often wrong about which men will shoot me. It is a thing you learn or you die. It was the closest thing to a joke she had made, and it startled a short breath of something like a laugh out of him. The first sound of that kind he had made in longer than he could remember, and he was grateful for the dark that hid what it did to his face. They found the herd on the 9th day. Mara had known where the river breaks were before they rode, and she led them by night through country Silas had never crossed, and they came out above a hidden basin at gray dawn, and looked down, and there they were, his cattle held in a box canyon, with a brush corral thrown across the mouth. Silas's breath came out of him slow, his whole life pinned below him, and on a picket line near the fire, plain even at that distance, a gray horse with a white face. She caught his arm the first time she had touched him and held it. "No," she said, low and hard. "You go down there, they kill you and burn you and tell the town my people did it. And it works, because it always works. Then there is no witness, and no cattle, and no you. That is not justice. That is only the last thing they need." "Then what?" he said. "I can't leave them." "We do not need the cattle down there," she said. "We need what down there proves. We need men who cannot be shot to see it and write it down. Your law belongs to Kel, but your law is not the only law." And she told him what she had been thinking for 6 days. There was 40 miles east at the county seat of Ferris Crossing, a circuit judge, a man named Halbrook, who came through twice a year and who did not belong to Kel, because he belonged to the territory, and to a governor who had grown tired of hearing that one county out west could not account for its own cattle or its own dead. There was also in Ferris Crossing a federal land agent, because much of the range Kel claimed was still public land held under lease, and a man who steals cattle to force a neighbor off public lease ground has committed a crime the county's bought lawman has no power to bury. Mara, who your people do not see, had spent years learning exactly which powers stood above the powers that oppressed her, because that knowledge was the only weapon a person like her was allowed to carry. She could not testify in Dolan's Wells, but cattle-wearing Silas Renner's registered brand, held in a hidden canyon beside a horse a dozen men could identify as Ambrose Kel's. That was a fact even Apache County could not swallow if the right men from above were standing over it looking down. So they did not go down. They marked the place and the count and the brands. They could read through the glass, and Silas drew it all in a tally book in his own careful hand, dated and detailed. And Mara told him the number of men and the marks of their horses, and everything her eyes had gathered, and he wrote that too in her words. And she made a mark beside it that she said was her name in her own tongue, so that it was her account and not his about her. Then they rode for Ferris Crossing, hard, and they got there at dusk. Of the 10th day it was not easy. A widower and an Apache woman riding into the county seat together turned every head on the street, and the first 2 men Silas tried to speak to would not hear a word once they saw who rode with him. But Judge Halbrook was not one of the valley's men, and the federal land agent, a dry, precise fellow named Ostler, who was already 3 months into a quiet fight with Kel over lease boundaries, was very much not one of the valley's men. And when Silas laid his tally book open on Ostler's desk and pointed to the 140 head of registered brand pinned on public lease ground beside a gray horse with a white face, exactly what she had seen from 3 days of watching, something changed in the room. Ostler asked her 3 questions meant to trip a liar. She answered all 3 without a flicker, and her answers matched the ground and the tally book and the map, and Ostler looked at the judge, and the judge looked at Ostler. And Halbrook said, "I have wanted a reason to ride into that county for 2 years. Mr. Renner has just handed me one. He did not say he believed the Apache woman because she was truthful. He said he believed the cattle and the brand and the horse and the public land under all of it. But Silas saw him look at Mara when she finished, and he saw that the judge had heard her, truly heard her, and it was the first time in the whole long story that anyone in a place of power had. They rode back with the judge and the land agent and 4 deputies. The judge brought himself, men who answered to the territory and not to kill. And that is how, on the 12th day, Ambrose Kell learned that the trick that had worked for 15 years had finally been worked on the wrong widower. Kell tried, of course. He came out to the canyon with his own men when word reached him, and there was a bad hour when it might have gone to shooting, 12 of his against 6 of the judges, and Silas and Mara on the rim. But Halbrook was standing in plain sight beside the penned cattle with the federal agent's paper in his hand, and 4 territorial deputies at his back, and a man like Kell, who has built everything on the county's law, cannot start a war against the territory's law without losing the very thing his empire is made of. Silas watched him understand it, watched the moment on that hard face when Ambrose Kell realized the story he had told the whole valley for 15 years had stopped working, and that the 2 people who had broken it were the widower he had bullied and the woman he had never once bothered to see. Kell did not confess. Men like that never do. But 2 of his 6 riders, looking at 4 deputies and a federal charge for theft on public land, decided very quickly that they would rather talk than hang. And once they talked, the gray horse with the white face was as good as a signed page. He did not hang either. That is the truth of it. And Silas came to make his peace with the hard, unpretty shape of it. Ambrose Kell lost the lease on 10,000 acres of public range that had been the spine of his whole holding. He lost the loyalty of the county, which turns fast on a man who is suddenly weak. He paid Silas back the full value of the herd and the cost of the search, and a sum besides that the judge saw too. And he left the valley within the year, rather than face what Osler kept coming back with. It was not the justice a hanging would have felt like. But Mara, watching Kell's wagon go over the ridge the following spring, said the truest thing anyone said about it. "They almost never pay for the burning," she said quietly. "But this one paid for the taking. And he leaves, and no one else will believe the story he built. That is more than I have ever seen. That is enough to build the next thing on." And Silas understood that she was not talking only about Kell, because somewhere in those 12 days and the slow season that followed, the thing had happened that neither of them had gone looking for. The cattle came home. The place filled up with the sound of a working outfit again, and Mara did not leave. She stayed in the lean-to through the summer, and they worked the range together, and she taught him to read the country the way she read it, and he found himself building a second corral and mending the porch rail and doing 100 small things a man does not do for a place he means to be alone in. He did not name it, and neither did she. For a long time, they were 2 people who had each carried grief until it became their shape, and neither of them trusted an easy word. It was Silas who finally spoke it in the fall on the porch, because he sat on the porch now, in the evenings, and one evening he had quietly set a second chair there, and she had quietly begun to sit in it, and they had watched the light leave the rock together enough times that the silence between them had become the most comfortable place either of them owned. He did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches, and she was not a woman who would have believed one. "I built the second chair before I knew I was building it," he said, looking at the rock and not at her. "Same as she built the porch before I was ready to sit on it. I've been thinking she saw further than me. She usually did." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not asking you out of what we owe each other. We're square on that. Kell paid, and it's done, and you could ride out tomorrow. A free woman and I'd have no claim. I'm asking because I'd rather have you in the second chair than the whole 140 head. That's the plainest way I know to say it." She was quiet a long time, watching the last of the light go off the high rock, the way she liked to. Then she said, "I keep my own name. The town's name for me was never mine. I will not take yours in place of it." A pause. "But I will sit in the chair, and I will stay, not because you saved my cattle." The dry ghost again at the very edge of her voice. "You did not save your own cattle. I found them. I am only agreeing to keep finding things for you, since you are so bad at it alone." And that startled the second laugh of his life out of him. A real one, this time, in the dark, and she let herself smile where he could see it, and that was the whole of the proposal and the whole of the answer, and it was enough, because it was true, and true was the only currency either of them had ever fully trusted. They were married that winter by the circuit judge himself, who made a point of riding out of his way to do it, and by an old man of Mara's people, whom she went and found in the river country, and brought back so that it was bound in both their laws, and belonged wholly to neither the town nor the tribe, but to the two of them alone. Osler signed as witness, and his signature on a federal document meant that no man in that county would ever be able to pretend the marriage was not real or the woman was not protected. The small community that had agreed for so long not to see her began slowly, in the grudging way of such places, to see her, because she was the widow Renner's woman now, because she read weather better than any man in the valley, because a child or two learned they could take a lame thing to her, and she would mend it. Things that go together find their way together. Given time and given offense taken down instead of built up. The place changed with 2 heartbeats in it instead of 1. Fruit trees Cora had planted and Silas had let go. Wild came back under Mara's hands. She kept up a practice through those years that Silas never fully understood, but came to love the sound of every evening. She would tell the day back to itself, aloud, low, in her own tongue, naming what she had seen. The hawk, the shift of the wind, the color that had come and gone off the rock. It was how she had survived. He understood. A person who is not seen learns to see so completely that the seeing becomes a kind of prayer, and she was teaching the day to be witness. He learned a little of the tongue, enough to know the word she used for the last light on the high stone, and he took to sitting in the second chair while she spoke the day, and honoring Cora that way too, because Cora had built the porch precisely so that someone would one day sit there. Years on, he found on his own arm and hers a pair of old scars that matched without either of them having planned it. His from the wire, the morning the cattle vanished. When he'd caught his forearm coming through the gate to reach her, hers from the night the men burned her camp, low on the same forearm, a burn-healed pale. They noticed it one evening, arms side by side on the porch rail, and neither said much, but he thought about it a long while after, how the same 6 men and the same one lie had marked them both in the same place. That was the thing he came back to, At the end of the long, slow seasons, sitting on the porch, Cora had seen coming, and he had not. Beside the woman the whole valley had agreed not to see, and he had chosen to. They had almost never let a man pay for the burning out there, and no one ever fully did. But the taking got paid, and the truth got spoken by the one voice they'd all agreed to silence, and out of 140 head vanished in the dark came the fullest life either of them had ever expected to have. A man loses everything overnight, and the person the whole world tells him to fear turns out to be the only one at his fence who knows the truth and will speak it. That is the whole of it. The dead see farther than the living, and they build us places to sit for when we are ready, and they trust us to catch up. And the smallest choice, a hand that goes for the rifle and then stops, a chair set out before it's needed, turns out to be the choice the whole life was hiding inside of. And Mara had a word for that too in her tongue, that she said the last light on the rock every evening. It meant, near as Silas ever got it, that the things meant to go together find their way together, no matter how many fences and how many lies the world builds up between them. He believed it. He had the second chair and the matched scar and the 12 days that had unbuilt 15 years of dark to prove it.